Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. Hey everybody, thanks for joining us this week. You've probably heard of the term debunking, which is to expose the falseness or pretentiousness of a particular claim. During the most recent election cycles, I feel like this term came up quite a bit as fact checkers have sought to debunk any and all false statistics or inflated claims made by politicians. Okay, so that's debunking. But have you heard of the term prebunking? Now, while the emphasis of prebunking also has to do with revealing falseness, you can probably tell by the prefix pre that prebunking has to do with exposing false claims before they're even made. How is that possible, Jim?
Well, it's interesting because I've only recently kind of learned a little bit more about this. I think it is kind of an interesting idea. It's really modeled after a vaccine, kind of a vaccination approach. The way a vaccine works is that you expose your body to an antigen, and meaning a toxin or other foreign type of substance, which then induces an immune response in the body. When you get a vaccine, your immune system responds to the antigen as if it had been exposed to the actual germ, and it makes antibodies and then remembers, in essence, how to defeat it, for the future. If the body ever gets exposed to the actual germ, the immune system recognizes it, knows how to quickly fight it off and prevent disease. Okay, have that in your head when you think about a pre-bunking campaign. A pre-bunking campaign follows the same approach, only the disease that it is attempting to vaccinate for is false information or a hoax or some type of conspiracy theory. It exposes people to a weakened dose of misinformation, coupled with an explanation of the truth so that people can develop mental antibodies that recognize and fend off the hoax. There's an article that I know both of us read and looked at that actually triggered this conversation. It's a really helpful introduction that we'll link to in the notes, show notes from the Washington Post that helped give me some of the background information, particularly about how this isn't relatively new. I mean, this is not really new. The pre-bunking term, actually, or the idea of it draws inspiration from this thing called an inoculation theory that was put forward by a social psychologist back in the 1960s. So it's been a while. His last name was McGuire. And what he posited was that you could prepare people to reject a misguided argument by first exposing them to a weakened form of that argument, along with a strong refutation of it, and it would work like a vaccine for the mind. Then when people encounter that argument in the wild, if you will, scrolling through their social feeds or whatever, the theory goes, they recognize it and they're less likely to fall for it. The reason that matters is because we've learned the hard way, and research has certainly backed this up, that it is almost impossible to counter misinformation once it has taken root online. I mean, it's just almost impossible. So the thinking is that instead of being reactive, we should be proactive. Instead of debunk, pre-bunk, particularly when the spread of false information is so exacerbated through the use of artificial intelligence. It's not just social media, it's AI. It's made it cheaper and easier to craft audio and photo and videos of events that never happened. I mean, it's really frightening to think about. Now, there is a downside to pre-bunking, which I think is obvious. The downside to pre-bunking is that when you teach people to be suspicious of messages and to mistrust messages that might be conveyed with a lot of emotional voltage, which is the way a lot of misinformation is spread, particularly the emotion of fear, you could also lead them to become generally suspicious of everything, including true claims. So anyway, that's how it works.
Yeah, that's helpful. Can you give us maybe a few more examples of how people might learn to pre-bunk information? Like what might they be looking for to determine if something is false or manipulative?
Yeah, a couple of examples. In the run-up to the recent European Union election, Google and partner organizations blanketed millions of voters with these really colorful cartoon ads on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram that taught common tactics that are used to propagate lies and rumors on social media or in an email. There was one that I watched. It was about 50 seconds in length, and it featured a fake news campaign that was about how visiting tourists were to be blamed for the litter crisis. Okay, that was the misinformation. The example was meant to educate voters about scapegoating, which is a very common way of spreading misinformation. And it's a disinformation technique, again, commonly used. It puts unwarranted blame for a problem on a single person or a single group. So they did this like a PSA, like a public service announcement. It was really interesting. Only instead of saying, drugs are bad or don't take rides with strangers, it came out and said people are trying to manipulate you. And one of the ways is, in this particular PSA, is through scapegoating. And here's what scapegoating looks like. Here's what it feels like. Here's what it sounds like. Imagine if you heard something that said all tourists are responsible for our litter crisis. And it makes you scapegoat tourists and think negatively toward visitors and so on. So that's how it's done. And they say, here's how to spot scapegoating. Here's how to resist it. Here's how to, not spread misinformation. It was actually quite effective. When I watched it, I thought, well, that's really interesting. There was here in the States, there was a small effort in the lead up to the 2020 election that was conducted by Twitter. And in the weeks leading up to the election, Twitter was placing advisories in the users' feeds saying that a couple of things, that voting by mail is safe and it's not uncommon. Don't worry if there's a delay in announcing election results. Now, the reason that they made those two things clear was because both were an effort to inoculate or pre-bunk voters against some of the more common false claims related to voting. There are no plans to conduct a mass campaign like that here in the U.S. like they did before the EU vote, but there are some localized efforts. One that I read about was in Arizona, and they used members of the NBA team, the Phoenix Suns, in these PSAs, if you will, to talk through voting procedures and, voting truths and voting, falsehoods and such. In essence, to pre-bunk everyone who might spread falsehoods about voter fraud and try to cast doubt on the upcoming, election results in that particular area. So.
Now, while pre-bunking is often associated with political or medical claims, we know that obviously it's not only within those two realms that we can become susceptible to naively or ignorantly accepting false information. And we also know that, presenting and then accepting false or manipulative information is not a modern phenomenon. I mean, just consider the history of propaganda. But what is different about the modern era in terms of how susceptible we have become to believing false information?
I was in London, and there was an exhibit at the British Library in one of my trips there in London titled "Propaganda: Power and Persuasion," and I was able to take it in. It was absolutely fascinating. It was a tour through the uses of propaganda for good and evil in the 20th and the 21st century. For most of us, we see or hear propaganda and instantly think of it in negative terms. In truth, it simply means to propagate something. That's where we get our word, propaganda. You propagate an idea, hence, the term. As a result, it can be used to incite war or to fight disease. It can foster unity or it can stir discrimination. So there's good propaganda and there's bad propaganda. The exhibit demonstrated, as it demonstrated, governments and national institutions have been the most prolific and expert users of propaganda as they strive to validate and justify their actions or build support for their aims and influence the behavior of populations. Yet the advent of the internet and the accompanying social media has made propaganda available as a powerful tool in almost everybody's hands, for good or ill. So let's look at it from what's bad about that and what is new to our world as a result. I actually, knowing we were going to talk about this and hoping we'd go this direction, brought in my notes from that exhibit because I took notes on, I tend to take notes on these kinds of things so I can remember, because they went through the various techniques used. So I think this might be of interest to people. So here are the user's guide to basic techniques of propaganda in our modern world. First, you establish authority. You link a person or an idea with existing symbols of power and authority that people understand and are comfortable with. The use of appropriate symbolism can just generate these deep psychological resonances. Second, you exploit existing beliefs. People are much more receptive to messages that build on attitudes and beliefs they already hold dear. So you add to those, you build off of those. And this plays on class, cultural, religious, national stereotypes. Third, appeal to patriotism. Play up nationalist sentiments and emphasize benefits of whatever it is you're saying to this nation. Fourth, create fear. In a state of fear, your audience is more likely to believe you. The technique is particularly effective if you play on existing anxiety and existing prejudices against people, groups, or behaviors to create scapegoats. Fifth, use humor. Making your audience smile or laugh can make powerful people, countries, ideas seem less threatening and even ridiculous. Humor is particularly useful if you are politically weaker than your opponent, which I found interesting. Sixth, imply that everybody agrees with you. Make that implication. The desire to fit in is so strong, and people want to go along with the crowd, and they will tend to go along with the crowd. So if you imply that everybody agrees with this, this isn't even contested, people are more likely to go along with it because they like that. Combine that with apparent plain speaking and appeal to the average person and deliver in a style that suits your audience, and you've got a powerful combination. Seventh, disguise the source. Carefully plant stories and facts so that they come from an independent source that your audience trusts. They will have less reason to question the messages you're spreading if you don't let them know really the origin of the idea, particularly if that would be controversial. Eighth, hammer it home. Decide on your message, stick to it. Saturate your audience, repeat it in as many different media as you can mobilize. Constant repetition will overcome that initial skepticism. Ninth, make false connections. Start with an uncontested statement and link it with something more controversial. Many people will not notice that there's no logical link between the two. Alternatively, link a person or an idea with a more general truism, either good or bad. 10th, be very selective about the truth. Control how and when information is released. Ensure only stories that support your position are reported. When an event is controversial, make sure only facts and testimony that favor your interpretation are heard. Finally, establish a leadership cult. Encourage the population to think their leader is solely responsible for all successes. Eventually, people may come to believe that their personal fate and that of the nation is inextricably bound up with that of the leader. So you look at all those, and if some of that sounds eerily familiar, or like you kind of sense that going on in various quarters of our world, that's because it is. That's how it works in our day. And what has hypercharged all of that is obviously the internet, and more specifically social media, and even how AI can come along and take that and run with it.
Well, who's behind the pre-bunking effort? Like, is this something that's being taught in schools, for example? Who stands to gain by helping others become more educated consumers of information?
Right now, the biggest concern seems to be with governments in regard to free and fair elections. And they are the biggest proponents. I mean, we all know how Russia tried to get in and play fast with our elections in 2020. And so people feel that democracy itself is under assault through hoaxes and misinformation. So most of the interest in pre-bunking is flowing from that particular concern. Here in the States, we know how much conflict, I mean, the charge of election fraud in the 2020 election has caused leading up to the insurrection of January 6th. No one wants a repeat of that in the 24 election. So no matter who wins, nobody wants that. So right now, the efforts regarding pre-bunking are really focused on election issues, voting. It's being encouraged and promoted by federal agencies and state and local officials to that end. The language that is being disseminated in those channels is to build a team of trusted voices to amplify accurate information proactively. And so that's the biggest stake in the game right now.
Yeah. As I was reading more about debunking, so this is a relatively new concept for me as well, I couldn't help but think about how in our age of relativism, or we talked more recently, metamodernism, I wonder if it's just falsity that we have a hard time recognizing, or if we also maybe struggle to recognize truth when we see it. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that question reminds me of how a bank trains its employees on how to spot a counterfeit bill. You don't study counterfeit bills. What they do is they study the real thing, and that's the way they do it. And they have them study it so carefully, so intensely that the real thing is so clear in their mind that then they can spot a counterfeit right away. That's the way the Christian mind ought to work. I think the reason we struggle, though, to recognize what is false is because we don't have a clear sense of the truth. You've told me of your little heresy quiz before one of your classes that you were teaching here, and how many heresies either people believed or they didn't recognize as a heresy. Now, obviously, when you have 70% of your growth coming from an unchurched background, which we do here at MEC, we're not shocked by that. That's why we have the classes. That's why we're trying to address those kinds of things with the people that we're reaching. But I think a lack of a solid foundation of biblical literacy, theological acumen, and human and also historical knowledge is just true across the board, whether you've been a Christian 10 weeks or 10 years. I think the key is to ground ourselves in what orthodoxy looks like, what truth looks like. It brings to mind what Paul obviously wrote to the Galatians. He wrote how evidently some people were throwing them into confusion and were trying to pervert the message of Jesus. So he said, in essence, you hang on to what a real bill looks like. This is how you're going to get through this. He says, so even if an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted, they're not, just be aware of that. This is your truth standard. The gospel was that real bill, and anything different from that was counterfeit. So make sure you have the gospel down pat.
I'm glad you brought up Paul and Galatia, because it is healthy to remember that the realm of Christianity is not immune to peddling false or manipulative information. And although studies show that Americans are less and less, unfortunately, trusting of clergy and pastors, there is something about religious rhetoric that makes truth claims sometimes more believable. I was thinking, if you could write up a guide for Christians about how to spot lies or misinformation regarding Christianity or the Christian life or the church, what are a handful of things that you think you'd include?
I think it's important to note that a good pastor, a good leader, is going to be actively engaged in pre-bunking. I do. I believe that. And that's not just my opinion. I mean, you see it all throughout the pages of Scripture. Let me give you some examples. When asked about the end times, Jesus gave a very extended answer about that, recorded for us in Matthew 24. So extended, it's called the Little Apocalypse, almost like a little Reader's Digest version of Revelation itself. But in that section of his teaching, Jesus did some serious pre-bunking. I mean, he said things like, many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. That's Straight up prebunking. He said, many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. The Apostle Paul did the exact same thing. We mentioned what he wrote in Galatians, but he did some pretty serious prebunking throughout his letters, particularly to the Corinthians. Bless their hearts. I think of his second letter to that group where he said, I know what you're going to hear about me. Let me tell you what you're going to hear. Let me tell you what you're going to think. You're going to think he writes these really strong letters, but in person, he's not very impressive. He said, that's what you're going to think. Let me tell you that right now. Well, that's kind of preparing them, isn't it? Yeah. And of course, he warned them time and again of wandering false teachers that could come their way. But to your question, I would draw up a list of, three things that I think are absolutely essential that every Christian should have down, every Christian should clearly understand, have clearly ingrained in their thinking, that will really let them navigate an awful lot of this information. The first one is the identity of Jesus. The identity of Jesus, that he is God the Son, second person of the Trinity. While on earth, he was fully God, fully man, the God-man. Any aspect of that gets played with or watered down should just start ringing bells going off in our head. Say maybe somebody, it seems like they're emphasizing his divinity at the expense of his humanity, or his humanity at the expense of his divinity, or they deny the triune nature of God, or, or maybe like it just, the Trinity was like sequential, like in this season it was God the Father, then it became Jesus the Son, or it became then this. No. The nature of Jesus is paramount. Second, there is the gospel itself. The message of Jesus. And, it's easy to say, okay, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him would not perish but have eternal life. You'd say that's the gospel. And I would say that is true. That is the gospel. But make sure you understand the three things that verse conveys, because it's critical to understand the gospel when we talk about the message of Jesus. First, it says, for God so loved the world. So that's the first, God's love. God's love is so remarkable because he loves us not for who we are, but in spite of who we are. No matter what we've done, God still loves us. As sinners who have broken God's commandments, we deserve his rejection rather than his love. But God loves us so much that instead of turning his back on us, he turns his face toward us. So God's love. For God so loved the world that he what? He gave. And so the second big aspect of the gospel is God's gift, and that gift is God's Son, Jesus. Because we have sinned, we deserve to die and be separated from God forever. But God gave his Son to take our punishment. Jesus is our substitute. On a cross, 2,000 years ago, he died for our sins. As God, he came back to life, proving he had conquered sin and death once and for all. Which brings us to the third part of the gospel. After God's love and God's gift comes God's offer for whosoever will. If we believe, we will be saved. The gift will become ours. The word believe means to trust. Knowing about Jesus is not enough. We have to place our trust in him alone to save us as our only way to heaven. And it's all a grace gift. We're not saved by anything we have done or ever could do. It's a gift. So any deviation from that, the gospel, is to be noted as deceit and lies. And again, bells and whistles and lights and sirens should start going off in our head. Anything about God not loving us, not giving us the gift of salvation through the death of Jesus on the cross, or that death not representing our sin taking our place, or that Jesus didn't rise again, or that we have to work to earn this gift, or it's not available to everybody. The gospel has to be clearly understood. So those two, the identity of Jesus, the message of Jesus. The third one that I would put on the list is the authority of the scriptures, which gives us, this all kind of hangs together, it's through the scriptures that we have the identity of Jesus and the message of Jesus. So I think one of the reasons the Bible is so attacked in our world is because Satan is absolutely terrified that people will read it, believe it, and discover the truth of God for their life. Because in that is the identity of Jesus and the message of Jesus, the way of salvation, which is exactly why it was given to us. And And so understanding not only its credibility, but its inspiration is decisive. And anything that tears away at the Bible for our lives or undermines our confidence in it or chips away as its nature of truth should be a huge red flag. So those are the three that I think we have to be pretty clear on.
This was such a healthy conversation because I think, as you both mentioned, the whole concept of pre-bunking, while relatively, I don't know, new to our thinking, is not new, and it's something that we should have been or should be thinking about kind of all throughout our lives, particularly within our faith. And so I do hope that there was a lot in here for people to take. I wish I had my pencil so I could have taken notes as you were reading. I'll grab them from you later. But yeah, so thank you for that. But thank you guys for listening. And yeah, we'll see. I'm not sure yet what we're going to talk about next week, but I hope you'll join us and find out with us.